Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Vijay Mehta, Chair of Uniting for Peace, and I'm pleased to see you all dedicated activists. All of you are the driving force, and your passion is behind all the social changes happening today. Today is an exciting day because this is a joint conference with United for Peace and with PeaceJam. And I hope it's the beginning of a very long, fruitful relationship. And I had a privilege of attending their conference in Winchester recently, which was one of the great events I have attended recently. Allow me to say a few words about Uniting for Peace. Working since 1979, Uniting for Peace is a non-profit organization devoted to creating and promoting a global culture of peace, non-violence, poverty reduction, and sustainable development. Many famous names, Nobel Peace Prize winners, cabinet ministers, members of parliament, peers have worked tirelessly for our organization for the past 36 years. I'm just going to give you 2 dates for your diary. 12th of June, we got a meeting in House of Commons on Brexit, rise of populism and Trumpism. Is a better world possible? And the second one is going to be here in Wesley's Chapel on 25th of November, and that is an all-day meeting like today on World Religions for Peace, and you are cordially invited to join us for these meetings. 10:30, 25th of November, Saturday. So today's meeting is about global terrorism. The terrorist attacks and threats are becoming a regular event, occurring almost every week somewhere around the world, with dire consequences of death, destruction, and fear, as we witnessed after the terror attack at Westminster this week. Considering the threat and the overall attacks around Paris here, there, I would request the speakers and the audience to come up with some counter-terrorism strategies. And this is my suggestion, that we should prepare an outcome document from this conference, which should be around 10 principles for tackling root causes of terrorism and proposals for solutions, which will be sent to the Prime Minister's office and Foreign and Commonwealth Office for implementation. Now, let me hand over to Caroline Millman, Chair of PeaceJam UK, to say a few words about their organization. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Caroline.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vijay, and good afternoon, everyone. It's just delightful to be here. And we're really grateful that we're partnering with Uniting for Peace, and very grateful to Vijay and his team for organising today. PeaceJam UK is growing, but we're not yet in London, hence this event today. So this is a little bit like a soft launch for us in London. I have some other PeaceJam colleagues with me, Fiona McCauley, who you're going to hear from later, but Sally Milne and Luke Addison and Pete, and I've forgotten his surname, and my husband Keith Millman. And we've travelled from far and wide around the UK to be with you here today. So this is a very exciting event for us. And we also hope that the partnership between us and Uniting for Peace is going to grow and prosper and do wonderful things in the future. We already operate in Yorkshire, in Hampshire, in South Wales and in Coventry, and actually on the Channel Islands. And Jersey is an island of peace, and we've played a little bit of part in that. The PeaceJam programs are proven to empower young people to make better decisions about how they choose to spend their lives, better decisions about how they treat others, and better decisions about how they may contribute to a more peaceful world in future. And our programs are particularly effective for the disadvantaged and the disaffected. So it's about time we came to London, but we need a bit of help to do that. So we're hoping that some of you here may have contacts with schools, universities, colleges, youth groups that we may then go on to talk to about the wonderful work that PeaceJam can do. And we really believe that if you start with young people and children and get them to have the right attitudes to begin with, then we're really on our way to making the world peaceful and to doing something about terrorism. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Caroline. To start the meeting today, let me introduce our chair, Rita Payne. She's our vice president of Uniting for Peace, a great one of our great supporters. She was the president of Commonwealth Journalists Association, a freelance journalist and media advisor. She is a former BBC Asia editor and BBC World News TV. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome today's chair, Rita Payne.
Good morning, and thank you, Vijay. And congratulations to Uniting for Peace and PeaceJam. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, I just want to thank Uniting for Peace, Vijay, and PeaceJam for organizing this conference, which is amazing. Okay? All right. Usually I don't have a very quiet voice, so you might reel from this. Yes, just want to say that it is so amazingly, uncannily timely. And what is most impressive is that from Vijay's opening comments and Caroline's, it's clear that it's not a matter of today of just wringing hands and saying, oh dear, what do we do? But actually wanting to come up with plans and a strategy and policies. And I think as Caroline's identified, and most importantly, it's crucial to get young people on board and not to make them feel alienated and get them to contribute towards peace building. We have got an excellent range of speakers, and I'm really delighted because I haven't had to organize this. All the credit goes to Vijay and the colleagues because we've got such a varied and eloquent and knowledgeable panel that I think we'll have a lot to think about today at this conference. Before I hand over, I just thought I came across a very, very interesting topical article by Patrick Coburn, who many of you may know from The Independent. And he's written brilliantly about extremism, and he looks at the causes. And he looks at the history, he looks at the context, which unfortunately not many people do today. So, and I hope you will find that this is worth sharing. He says, Europe is facing an unprecedented crisis and growing terror threat as homegrown extremists inspired by jihadis and an Islamic State, squeezed by the West, are desperate to attack outside the caliphate. And he says the capture of Salah Abdeslam, thought to be the sole surviving planner of the Paris massacre, means that the media is focusing once again on the threat of terrorist attack by Islamic State. Questions are asked about why the most wanted man in Europe was able to elude the police for so long, even though he was living in his home district in Brussels. Television and newspapers ask nervously about the chances of ISIS carrying out another atrocity. And we've seen, although it's not proved it's ISIS, but there are indications that the attacker was inspired by the thoughts and ideology of extremists. And he goes on to say, which is very, very crucial, he says that what is happening is that the outside world scarcely noticed events that happened elsewhere outside the West. That means the killings and attacks are part of the natural order now in Iraq and Syria. But the total number of Iraqis killed by two specific attacks and suicides was about the same as 130 people who died in Paris at the hands of ISIS last November. But this is crucial. He says there's always been a disconnect in the minds of people in Europe between the wars in Iraq and Syria and terrorist attacks against Europeans. This is in part because Baghdad and Damascus are exotic and frightening places, and pictures of the aftermath of bombings have been the norm since the US invasion of 2003. But there is a more insidious reason why Europeans do not sufficiently take on board the connection between the wars in the Middle East and the threat to their own security. Separating the two is much in the interest of Western political leaders, because it means that the public does not see that their disastrous policies in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and beyond created the conditions for the rise of ISIS and for terrorist gangs to operate in the West. So there is much more to this article, but I just thought I would read out just some of these points, which I'm sure will be picked up in due course. And since we're going to have a lot of chopping and changes with speakers, and while we wait for His Excellency the Ambassador of Denmark to arrive, I will invite Dr. Fiona Macaulay to say a few words. Fiona is author and director of PeaceJam UK and a senior lecturer in development studies in the University of Bradford. She has given presentations at high-level conferences and also contributed to the BBC World Service. And ladies and gentlemen, so I hand you over to Dr. Macaulay, and the topic is doing peace successfully.
Thank you very much. If we all knew the answer to the question of how do you do peace successfully, we could all go home now. It's not an easy thing to do, because all of us who have been involved in the peace movement have faced different challenges. My personal involvement, for example, began when I was at university, just up the road from Greenham Common, and that, of course, was the period of threat of nuclear warfare, particularly being conducted in Europe. And so there was an existential threat then that people mobilized around. And now we are feeling that somehow there is an existential threat now. And I think that one of the points that I will make is, how do we understand that existential threat, and how do we get over feelings of powerlessness about it, and how do we get it into proportion, and how do we figure out what are the strategies for actually making change. Now, we know from the 1980s with the nuclear threat that many of the people in this room, I think, were highly instrumental in mobilizing public opinion against the way that the governments were conducting their business and rejecting particular narratives about security and safety. Oh, we're doing this for your own good, for your own safety. And that, I think, is one of the contexts now, as you mentioned, with Brexit, with Trump, with the rise of right-wing parties all across Europe now, that there is an inward-lookingness, a kind of an us and them. And the new populism that we're facing is all about, we'll look after the us. We want maybe populist policies of welfare and so forth, but just for us. We don't want them to have any of this stuff that we have. So we're in a very interesting moment now where the us and them constructions are seeping all through society. They're being re-articulated by politicians, they're being repeated by popular media. If any of you are on social media, there's a flood of that kind of us and them rhetoric, and the amount of sort of hatred that flows through social media targeted at the them. It could be the people who supported Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders. It could be the migrants, the refugees, the swarms, the hordes, and so forth. So we're at a moment where we're looking at a question of a vision of society. And terrorism, such as it is always a reflection of one group in society deciding to use violence to get to their vision of the good society. And on the other side, there are plenty of competing views of that good society. Now, the roots of terrorism are, of course, multifarious, and I certainly won't have time to get into that now. But I think it's very, very important not to see it as a big sort of untouchable thing. Because if we bring it right down to basics, PeaceJam UK works with young people, and we deliberately work with young people who are feeling marginalised, vulnerable, possibly in themselves, in their identities, humiliated because they don't fit in, because they're not accepted, because they're bullied at school, because nobody will talk to them. And when you were at the conference last week, you will have heard young people say exactly those things. There is a lot of hurt and anger, particularly amongst young people, amongst young men, and I want to talk about gender. And where do they take that? They hook on to these big, shiny promises of these armed groups out there, because otherwise, how do you explain why a 14, 15-year-old girl from Birmingham will get her passport, go to the airport and get on a plane to Turkey and go to Syria? How can you possibly explain such a life-threatening decision on the part of that young person? They don't understand the theology, they don't understand the politics, they're not making full, rational, calculated decisions, they're reacting emotionally. And actually, if you look at a lot of the studies on global terrorism, and if you look at who joins and why they do not often join for ideological reasons. If you were to ask people who support the EDL, or the National Front, or any of our kind of homegrown ultra-right and violent groups, these young men are not really joining them because of some kind of sophisticated ideological understanding of fascism. They're joining because they want group bonding, they want identity, they want recognition that comes from the use of violence. And so one of the points that I want to make is to do peace successfully is to recognise, in my mind, two things. One, that emotion is a fantastically important driver of human action. And there is a fantastic book by Cynthia Coburn who talks about masculine humiliation as being at the root of many different types of violence, whether young men joining militias in West Africa, joining the Taliban, all kinds of different expressions of violence, which often end up in acts of terrorism. That is the spectacular use of violence to achieve a broader aim of fear, and it could actually have very little ideological content behind it. It's just, one study of Chechnyan rebels showed that young men joined because it was fun to blow stuff up. You take that seriously and you realise that if we do not start with some of those emotional drivers in our own society, we can't do everything right. We can't affect young people in Germany joining ISIS or supporting them, but we can do a great deal in our own communities to make sure that those people who are experiencing alienation and are then sort of joining up because of what they see on the internet and those kinds of promises, that's not a pathway that they follow. And the only way you can divert them is actually to engage with them on that very, very, very fundamental emotional plane. Yes? And that's to do with social inclusion, it's to do with listening, it's to do with empathy. Yeah? Now, most of us here in this room, we probably will never know if we would ever talk to somebody who might have been radicalised, right? It's one of the great mysteries of de-radicalisation and prevent work is how do you spot them? You can't. That's a real mystery. But what you can do is look at structures in society. And so to do peace successfully from the point of view of PeaceJam UK is to understand that deprivation, social exclusion, humiliation in its many, many forms is the soil within which bad decisions are made. Now, okay, we can talk about things like, so what about the global? You say, so why are we not talking about what's happening in the Middle East? What can we do about that? But there is a relationship between the two things. I'll give you an example. When Israel was bombing Gaza some months ago, we got a phone call in the Peace Studies Department from local schools who reported that young men of Muslim origin were coming into school in the morning, 15-year-olds, they'd be watching the news broadcast the night before, and they were just beside themselves with frustration and despair. What can I do? This seems so wrong. They disagreed with what Israel was doing, and they were furious. And the teachers literally did not know how to have that conversation with them. So what we did, actually it was Paul Rogers and others who did this, we did a workshop for teachers, so they could talk about the global context, and then also to enable teachers to deal with the emotional space that was present in the classroom, so that by a process of dialogue, those young men could calm down, and then they could say, okay, well, I'm angry. What can you do positively? You can raise money for medical aid for Palestinians. You can support Médecins Sans Frontières. You can do a number of things that are helpful, so you can channel your anger, which could well have just boiled out into the streets in Bradford, to be honest, or it could have resulted in playground fights, or it could have resulted in those young men getting on a plane. Who knows? But they didn't, because we engaged with them both on the global politics. Young people are not stupid. We underestimate teenagers, right? They think about this stuff all the time. They talk about this stuff all the time. And our experience of most high school education is it's sit down, shut up, write this down, and get the grade. And that's happened to my son, so I've seen it, It is a very, very foreclosing space. So PeaceJam UK, how much time do I have? Oh, good. I can go for hours. I'm like the sort of Fidel Castro. 5 minutes. So the point is that PeaceJam UK kind of recognises that the way to engage and prevent is to work at that level. And so our aim is not just to get young people to see that there are good choices that can be made, positive choices. We all have boiling emotions about things. Now, you can take a bad path with that or a positive path with that. Masculinity is also a huge issue. So you need to recognise that boys in particular are going to be attracted by violence because it's part of the cultural package of masculinity in current society. And you only have to watch one of the Die Hard films or whatever to recognise the truth of that. And the second thing I wanted to say is also more about gender. Because in our youth conferences now, it's great that we have a mixture, about 50-50 of boys and girls. It wasn't like that to begin with. And when we first started out with PeaceJam, and many of the laureates who are involved in PeaceJam are women, actually, is that we often had more girls in the room because girls seem to put their hands more often. It's like, I want to be involved in peace. And that's why I started with the story of Green and Common. Thousands of women mobilised in the 1980s against nuclear weapons in the most fantastic and effective manner. The challenge, there's a twofold challenge. One is, how do you make peace cool for boys rather than violence? And the second, because every time there is a terrorist attack and faith leaders are called together, I looked at the newspaper picture yesterday in The Guardian of the faith leaders standing together. I think there was something like 12 men and 2 women. That's a problem. That is a big problem because women are very active at the base of peace movements and social movements, but rarely do they get to be seen as leaders. Rarely do they get to be in the high-level conversations, and yet women are so much part of the social structure that will actually change ways of thinking about conflict resolution from a school level, from a community level, from a family level, all the way upwards. So those are 2 messages. One is that we need to include women politically, and so part of PeaceJam is also about empowering girls to be leaders in peace for the future. And they have been leaders. The Nobel laureates are there. They are proof of that. The Greener women are proof of that. But somehow, in many political spaces where we discuss terrorism and violence, we somehow sort of forget to invite the women. And then we also need to get boys to see that peace is cool and it's something for them that will improve their lives. So that's the PeaceJam vision of what works, I think, in terms of doing peace. Emotion and recognizing the very personal drivers of decision making that inevitably connect to those much wider global processes. Thank you.
I accepted the invitation around a half a year ago. I did not know it was going to be such a topical issue. But could I then start also by thanking you for coming here today on such a beautiful day with a lot of sunshine, and which of course puts the horrors we saw on Wednesday in a particular perspective. So I would like to start by offering my sincere condolences to all the innocent victims and their families and the British people for the in relation to the atrocities which we witnesses on Wednesday at Westminster Bridge. But if you look at the recent attacks, it's difficult to establish a clear pattern. A truck, even a four-wheel drive car, can now become a weapon. A Christmas market or Westminster Bridge, as we saw, can be the crime scene. So preventing further attacks and future attacks from happening is very difficult. Here in London, we have grown used to living with a threat level set as severe, the next highest level for a number of years, meaning that a terrorist attack is highly likely. In Denmark, we have experienced terrorist attacks as well. 2 years ago, 2 people were shot dead by a lone wolf terrorist inspired by international Islamistic propaganda. We too have had to accept the ever-present threat of a terrorist attack. And the challenge this threat poses to our society is the same for all of us, regardless of the scale, and how to fight these dark forces at home and abroad, while staying true to our values and remaining open societies and safeguarding our way of life, committed to the upholding of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And we will not compromise on this. No matter what measures we take, it will not be possible to provide a complete guarantee against future attacks. The task is for us to find ways to minimize the risk of such attacks taking place. And this requires an effort of both national and international level. And it requires support to the local level in those frontline states that are the sources and very often also the first victims of terrorism and violent extremism. We need to acknowledge that there are no easy solutions to complex problems, and no one-stop shop stocking all the ready-made answers, even though some might try to convince you. For a long time, the international community primarily addressed violent extremism by concentrating on counterterrorism measures, with a strong focus on hard security means. And no doubt, military action remains an indispensable instrument in the fight against terrorism. Denmark has consistently stepped up to the plate when the international community has called upon nations to participate in counterterrorism operations. Denmark is presently contributing to the coalition fighting ISIL in Iraq and Syria, together with the British. We have had considerable military action, however, cannot stand and provide a long-term solution and cannot stand alone. That is a lesson we have learned the hard way in Afghanistan and in Libya. A growing number of countries have reached the same conclusion. So at the heart of the countering violent extremism approach is the recognition that military defeat of today's terrorists is not sufficient to curb the ideology leading to violent extremism or to address the broader factors needed to prevent new terrorists from emerging. The counter-violent extremism approach takes a different route and seeks to prevent the next generation from becoming radicalized by reaching out to the most vulnerable groups, and equally important, by pushing governments to address the underlying grievances which violent extremists exploit. In other words, we must pair military efforts to defeat groups like ISIL with a comprehensive civilian-led effort to prevent the next ISIL, at home and abroad. That's also why we are using the soft tools to deal with the hard issues. A range of international actors have moved towards a more holistic approach to counterterrorism. The UN Secretary General's Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism from 2016 is an illustration of this. It emphasizes respect for human rights, good governance, and anti-corruption as powerful antidotes to terrorism. The plan specifically stresses that misuse of religion can be used to divide nations, cultures, and people. States are creating their own counter-violent extremism action plans. In Denmark, the government released such a plan in October last year. In the plan, we acknowledge that we continuously need to build trust and ensure effective coordination between civil society actors, security actors, and governments and authorities. The terrorists wish us to act against our own values and against each other. They cherish opportunities to accuse us of having double standards. They exploit this to create divisions within our societies, to recruit followers and strengthen their own morale. States and the international community alone cannot fully address the many factors that fuel violent extremism. We also need strong engagement from local actors in conflict-ridden regions. Local voices must take the lead in speaking out against violent ideologies and propaganda. We have had considerable success with the so-called Danish, or as we call it, the Aarhus model, which brings together multiple stakeholders at municipality level to cooperate on addressing radicalization. This has provided a blueprint for some of our international efforts. Of course, the Danish model cannot be copied one-to-one. The differences between a mid-sized town in Denmark and one in Iraq, Syria, or Lebanon are obviously huge. The crucial point, though, is the coordination at the local level. If we are able to facilitate dialogue and build the necessary resilience here at the local level, terrorist groups will struggle to find new followers. Apart from our military contribution, Denmark is rolling out, therefore, programs assisting the countries in the Middle East region in countering terrorist financing and money laundering through capacity building and co-led in the counter-ISIL financing subgroup on illicit flows. We are also preventing radicalization at the local level together with local authorities through what we call the Strong Cities Network, and we are confronting ISIL's propaganda on the social media. The Danish government just approved a new program for civil society support and stabilization in Syria and Iraq, as the territory is liberated little by little from ISIL's dark reign. We must prevent these areas from again becoming a breeding ground for terror. And that requires responding to citizens' call for decent living conditions, security, and a meaningful role in governing their own country. That's why Denmark welcomes very much the UN Secretary General Guterres' efforts to establish a new UN counter-terrorism structure. But also here it's important, in our view, that the United Nations will engage in counter-terrorism, extremism combating, not just counter-terrorism. Some member states would prefer that the United Nations to focus exclusively on counter-terrorism aspects. We obviously disagree with this approach. We need, in our view, the broadest possible approach. And in our view, the United Nations is uniquely placed to deliver exactly that. The proof of the pudding, as we all know, is in the eating. And that's also why efforts to streamline the structure can only be a first step towards improving the United Nations' role and impact in countering terrorism and preventing violent extremism. Member states, in our view, must show some real political will, and United Nations needs to show that it can deliver out there on the front line where it matters, together with ordinary people. Thank you very much. As Rita said, yes, I have to take a train up to York because I have to make another speech later today on Brexit. So, but that's a completely different topic, but I will take some questions.
Thank you very much. I think, the main point that really comes across, at least to me, and you may agree, is just a knee-jerk military response is not enough. You need local engagement. So if you've got any quick questions, brief please, no speeches, then we can take maybe 3. So let's do 1 and 2 at the beginning with. So the gentleman at the back.
Wait, James.
I'm disappointed to hear that
It is on, yes.
that Denmark is supporting the attacks on ISIS. Because isn't it true that ISIS is really a result of the attacks that we produced on Iraq and then during the occupation caused the Sunni people, nearly 1 million of them, to leave their own country. And they also have the intention, I think, of building a kind of caliphate in order to get their region back under Islamic control. Could you ask your government to review that support and perhaps tell the United Nations and indeed NATO that it's not a good idea to be attacking the very people we've already upset?
Well, I am representing the Danish government, so you have just asked me. It's a perfectly legitimate point of view, and of course it's at the core of the discussions we often have, because we are confronted, in our view, with a dilemma. Should we passively watch foreign states, government, authorities, non-state actors like ISIL terrorizing ordinary, innocent people in their own countries? Should we passively sit back behind the television in our peaceful lives at home and watch these atrocities? Denmark belongs to one of those countries, also like the United Kingdom, which do not think so. We know very well that by participating with military means in combating ISIL in Iraq and Syria, we are also to some extent, let's say, making ourselves more likely as a target for terrorism. But with the approval of the Danish Parliament, with the approval of the Danish people and a large part of the Danish Parliament, we agree that it's worth this to run this risk in order to try to save and protect the lives of innocent people in these countries. Because, yes, we can discuss it, but that's at least the way we approach it. But it is a dilemma, I agree perfectly with that. And of course, in an ideal world, we should all live peacefully together. But unfortunately, as we can see, the world is not ideal.
Thank you for your Danish model, fond memories of visits, and our house, I think, is the capital of Jylland. But the 3 principles you gave, respect for human rights, good governance, I didn't get the third one, unfortunately.
Well, it is the rule of law and democracy. Democracy, yes. But as I say, the model in such, the core of it is, of course, it's based on these values which we all cherish in our societies. And I think it's very important when you look upon the way the world is running right now, with an increasing amount of uncertainty, conflict, and unrest, that we all stand by these values. And we don't take for granted that others will protect these values for us. We also have to make our contribution, each of us individual, and try to fight and maintain what we cherish the most. The model as such is exactly that, but at a very local level, as you also, I think, have working on in the UK in the areas of where radicalized extremism can take a foothold.
Has this been taken on board by fellow Scandinavian countries?
Yes, it is taken on board, yes.
Thank you. My name is Chris Coverdale from Make Wars History. One of the main causes of terrorism really are the wars and the attacks on Israel, on Afghanistan, Iraq, and all the other nations in the Middle East. All of these have been illegal under the international laws of war. All the coalition governments are breaking the UN Charter and the UN Declaration on Principles of International Law. I want to know why and what you and your government can do to start to get our coalition governments to uphold and enforce the laws that we have set for the last 70 years.
Thank you very much. We don't agree with you on that. We think that we have a perfectly sound and legal base, which also has been confirmed by the United Nations Security Council. That went for Libya also. It goes for our support of the Afghan government in Afghanistan, and it also goes for Iraq. I know you have had a long debate. We also have had a long political debate in Denmark about the intervention in Iraq. But the reason why we based our legal decision on that was not because of the possible existence of weapons of mass destruction, but that was because the Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq at that time, had constantly violated UN Security Council resolutions urging him to deal with his country in a decent manner and treat his people accordingly. And when you constantly and all the time break international law, we think there's a limit to how long time you should look passively to that. But of course, I understand your view, and we also know many people have that view. But again, I would say, I mean, we cannot, if we just sit passively and watch that others are mistreating their own people and behaving in complete violence with international norms and international rules that they themselves and values that they themselves have supported and underwritten. We think that in the long run we will be the losers if we don't stand up to fight for what we cherish the most.
Right.
So one last question, and then I will have to run to King's Cross.
Yes, I'm going to ask you the question. You talk about laws and rules, and you talk about the Islamic State, but the word Islam actually means peace, and I believe that the Muslims have the same Ten Commandments as the Jews and the Christians, and that so one of the basic rules of their religions is not to kill. So it would seem that the Islamic State has nothing to do with Islam, and therefore to call it the Islamic State is not helpful to the peace movement, because obviously, as Caroline was talking about emotions, and people who feel squeezed and pressured react violently by throwing the remote control across the room or whatever, and in lesser, yeah. So, do you believe that if Muslim leaders stood up and said, actually, the Islamic State are not Muslims and they shouldn't be allowed to call them Islamic State, would that help people being less encouraged to join something that they believe is good, i.e. that?
We could also call it Daesh, as some of the Islamic State leaders already do. It has many names. Yes, of course. And many Islamic leaders and leaders of Islamic states have denounced ISIL very strongly and also said that they are not representative for the Islamic faith. And we agree completely with that, as that's also why I said that religion is misused and misrepresented by people, by extremists, for other aims, which has nothing to do with religion. That's also why we have a special responsibility in order to safeguard and protect all the different religions in our countries. The relative amount of Muslims in Denmark is more or less the same as here in the UK. And we are extremely attentive to safeguard these groups of ordinary, decent people who are just living a completely normal life. And we are very attentive that terrorists do not try to create divisions within our societies between us, no matter which faith we have or no faith. And that's also why, because when we see attacks like we did on Wednesday, they want to create divisions within our societies. They want us to start fighting with each other. And you see, that's also why we have to protect the religions and respect them. This has nothing, terrorism have nothing to do with religion, not whatsoever. It's a power game with other aims where religion is misused as one of the reasons for that. But of course, they try also to create a lot of emotions and to put people up against each other through these means. And that's also why we have to counteract to that and safeguard our way of life and live our lives as normal as we can. That's the best way forward.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you for coming on such a wonderful spring day when I'm sure you want to be sitting out in the garden, and also to be open to various questions, because as you can see, everyone feels passionate about these issues. And I think Vijay would like to have a word as well.
I just say thank you to the ambassador to come here to a peace movement. We often try to get the ministers, the present ministers, but they duck our meetings. So thanks for coming. And secondly, probably you don't know, he hosts United Nations Associations meetings regularly, and I have been to his embassy, a very plush place. And I'm just requesting him that if he could consider a joint Uniting for Peace and PeaceJam conference at his embassy in the future.
No. Thank you very much.
Dr. McCool is the founding director of the European Centre for the Study of Extremism at Cambridge. He specializes in international and Middle East media. He received International Reuters Award for Journalism. And he'll be talking, he's got a very intriguing topic, between extremism and terrorism. So I'm sure what he has to say will give rise to a lot of questions to follow. So after he's spoken, I just need to clarify whether, are you going to stay till the end of the conference? Pardon? Are you going to stay till the end of the conference?
I hope so.
Okay. In which case we will save now questions and answers till all the speakers have had their say. So please put your hands together for Dr. Makram Khoury Makhul.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, Vijay, for inviting me to speak here today. In fact, I've known Vijay for quite a long time, perhaps one of those personalities I met quite a long time whilst attending an activist's program. Before I begin, I'd like to give you the perhaps framework of this speech that I'm going to deliver. It should be seen within the framework of an initiative which is on the one hand academic, but on the other hand it's practically a moral educational academic initiative. It is not an NGO similar to Uniting for Peace because it's about research. But what I found in the flyer that I received from Vijay was one very pertinent question, which is, how do we respond to the current phenomena of violence? And I'll try to show how we, when I say we, myself and colleagues, academics mostly, have decided to respond to the current and ongoing and unfolding phenomenon. I always say that before peace, we need dialogue. And before dialogue, we need to study whatever brought us into conflict. And I reached the conclusion that the dominant discourse about global terror that is currently promoted by various establishments, advisors, security, consultants, media, etc., even at times from academia itself, is that we are seeing a tendency toward what we call reactionary responses, which means that our response, which I'm going to talk about, is in fact, in our opinion, is defined as a modern response. Much of our independent expert and collective discussion has evolved in response to the trend, i.e. the trend of reactionary responses. Specifically, we have found in addressing the social, political, as well as media processes that are reactionary in nature, many of these problems can become clearer if we discuss and perhaps deconstruct this discourse. These factors are unnecessary, we think so, and they contribute practically to needless suffering. So our aim was to establish a center which deals with the study of extremism, which is the European Center for the Study of Extremism, Cambridge, or in short, EuroCSE, Euro-CSE. So this is the type of center that would like to conduct research, hold events, and participate in events such as these in order to explain about the correlation between extremism and other types of phenomena or factors with regard to global terror. With this more integrated, comprehensive approach, we are working to create a sustainable and compassionate interventions. Some of us think that if we are in academia, so we should look at it as an ivory tower, remote and distanced from any moral or social activity. We do not think so. Even those who say that, I'm sure that they've got an agenda, but they are cowardly enough in order to hide it. One question that emerges is, how do we shift from a system of public opinion, i.e. whatever these factors or elements decide to do in order to brainwash or convince us to believe in something. So how, in fact, do we shift from a system of public opinion and the construction of daily political reality across the globe from one of potentially exaggerated, we think so, practically emotionally exaggerated, towards an informed one which has got programs for embetterment. Having witnessed myself, and I am a Palestinian who has been living in the UK in the last stretch for 18 years, having witnessed a lot of accounts of wars, terrorism, radicalization, extremism, including being shot in the face in the Gaza Strip whilst I was a journalist. So having witnessed all of these and having spent 20 years in media and 30 years in academia, I've seen the darkest sides of humankind activities. I and my enlightened academic colleagues at EuroCSE felt that this dysfunctionality in human nature needed to be addressed, and an educational academic research center needed to be established to put these social phenomena in a structured context and healthful order. No doubt, the mission to disentangle social events such as wars, terrorism, radicalization, and extremism is not an easy one, especially during heightened periods. A quick observation, ladies and gentlemen, leads us to discover that terrorism studies, security studies, and political violence studies is partly embedded as part of international relations, intertwined as well with war studies. In the United Kingdom alone, there are more than 32 departments or centers offering such topics. The dominant discourse throughout all of these approaches is embedded within conflict, and in many cases, the intractability of these problems predominates. Indeed, terrorism, we argue at Euroxe, is the final product within a long line of conflictual processes, including a heightened risk of radicalization, which then can end as terrorism. So, the order, according to our concept and framework, is as follows. First comes extremism, then a process of radicalization, and then terror, an act of terror. So, all of these are points of the continuum of the expression of dysfunctional social environments. Ladies and gentlemen, just look at the example from 2-3 days ago, and you will discover, and I was yesterday on 2-3 TV channels, and I was asked, how do you explain that this man, who the perpetrator of the events 3 days ago, is actually neither an Arab nor a Muslim. He's a convert. He's practically, his name isn't Khalid Masood. His name is Adrian so-and-so. How do you explain this? So this is exactly the dysfunctional situation and framework that we are talking about, which in fact paves the way for extremism before it ends up in terror. The European Centre for the Study of Extremism, Euroxe, Cambridge, aims at bringing an archetypal shift, I repeat, an archetypal shift in the study of the evolution of extremism in the mind. It's in the mind first. This transformation needs to include factors in the mind, in the body, as well as in the environment. These interactive zones are transformed within different social environments as well, that contribute to its development and then back in the most dynamic of ways. In the worst of these cases, it can appear in the form of a radicalized human being who is open to carry out an act of various types of mindless violence to instigate, or practically to instigate someone else to carry these acts. So our center, Euroxe, wishes, in the more European tradition, if you wish, to A, demilitarize, deterrorize, and de-radicalize this field by focusing on the first seed. By focusing on the first seed and problematic origin at work. In other words, we now discover that this perpetrator, in fact, had a serious criminal record. He, on the one hand, had nothing to do with Arabs or Muslims, etc. But on the other hand, we see that his criminal record may have, I haven't studied him, may have linked or married with Wahhabi ideology in Saudi Arabia and came back to perhaps a deprived conditions or situation in the UK, whereas we saw the results a few days ago in Westminster. Excuse me. So we need to spool back to find and humanely treat the unhealthful relationships that give rise to these forms of violence. But we need to do this on an entirely new and deeper level by divorcing the so-called security paradigm first. To understand these processes and to successfully disentangle all of these factors, we need to make use of a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approach towards research, because it's only then when we look not only about religion, when we look about sociology, psychology, politics, deprivation, poverty, education, that only then we can understand what happened to this person and what took him from being an English teacher to a terrorist practically stabbing in the streets of London. This is the field of inquiry that Euroxe is interested in discovering. And there is a lack here of research. As I said, we have hundreds of so-called experts talking about terror, about the guns they use, about the type of cars, but this is the end result of a long process, and they are overlooking this long process. And hence, it's difficult to understand why we are here. So, for if we look at current political violence and accept the confusion dominating the discourse of stereotypes and prejudice, assuming that extremism is generated by one religion, one faith, one nationality, and one race. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the case. So practically, if someone here look at me and say, oh, hang on a minute, he's an Arab, Palestinian, oh, maybe he's as well a so-called terrorist. But then if I tell you, but hang on a minute, I'm actually a Palestinian Christian. Oh, no, you're fine. Actually, you are one of us. It doesn't work like that, ladies and gentlemen. Look at this man. He wasn't a Muslim at all. I'm talking about this Adrian Khaled invention. So, we can't only look according to these stereotypes, ignoring deprivation, isolation, and as you must have heard, oh, he's a married man with 3 children. He just recently became a grandfather. How come? So this is why we need to look at deprivation, isolation, marginalization, frustration, economic situation, which when coated with a set of norms and expectations and directed by extremist ideology, i.e. the very fact that he visited Saudi Arabia and was exposed for 5-6 years for whatever Wahhabi version of a so-called religion, only then we can understand why this man went that far. So, there is a risk that we end up adopting only the security paradigm, and I'm here representing a center, Euroxe, which actually would like to de-securitize, demilitarize our paradigm. We cannot start with the end. We need to start with the beginning. And this is why we do not at all encourage anyone to adopt the security paradigm and start believing that these actions should be dealt with from a security lens only. Oh, a group of Cobra and security people just had a very important meeting, an emergency meeting, and they discussed how they can tackle terrorism. Really? Is this the solution? Hence, not only give up any hope for rehabilitation, desocialization, or resocialization. We know that in sociology and psychology, we can desocialize an extremist person through processes of rehabilitation. We can resocialize them. We can make again a positive person out of anyone. But then, if we allocate money for arms deals, how can we allocate money for educational processes? We would like to think that Euroxe is a research and educationally moral, rational, and responsible center. It sees itself as one body within what is called social agency. To remind you, ladies and gentlemen, a social agency in sociology is normally in charge of the educational processes of children or youth. These agencies are normally either family, school, religious institution, clubs, media, and universities. And we see ourselves, as Euroxa, we see ourselves as perhaps one social agency aiming at studying, using in particular, but not limited to, political science and clinical health psychology, understanding and explaining emotional turmoil, including survival struggle, fear, threat, anger, trauma, as cause of behavioral aggression via its fields of inquiry. By shedding light on the fact that socializing societies in a tolerant and pacifist manner, I repeat, in a tolerant and pacifist educational manner, through addressing the situation, it is possible, we believe, that the entire spectrum of the worst of humanity needs to be integrated with that of understanding the best of us as well. This would lead us, ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell to say that our mission as an independent academic non-for-profit center to provide critical analysis, promote mature dialogue, as well as accountability, and at times use unique intel-based tools to empower communities to strive to be better and to work toward compassionate change. And finally, Euroxa wishes to facilitate debates on political, security, and socio-economic impacts of violent extremism with the intentionality of developing a meaningful dialogue of healing, truth, and transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Khoury Makhloul, for telling us more about the work, valuable work that you're doing, which is really moving away just instinctive reactionary responses. We will now hear from someone you're all familiar with, Reverend Brian Cooper, who, as you know, is Interfaith Secretary and Coordinator for Uniting for Peace. His tireless work includes running the Scotland office for Uniting for Peace, along with hosting events for churches, interfaith groups, including celebrating the UN International Day of Peace every year. So welcome, Brian.
If you have any questions, please restrain or write it down, because there is Reverend Brian Cooper who's going to speak, and after that you'll have to put up with me for 10-15 minutes. And after that, we are going to open up the question-answer session. So be patient, and we will get through all of you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends. I have in my study a very thick file marked Terrorism, stroke, Interfaith, etc. It has at least 50 or more articles and about the similar number of my own scribblings. I will not attempt to share all that with you this afternoon, but out of that file I pulled about a dozen sheets. Even that I can't share all of, and I will therefore make rather disjointed remarks, mainly because I thought I was going to bat last at the end of the most illuminating innings of all the others, and I would come in just at the tail end, you see, like a game of cricket. However, I find myself more to the fore than I expected. However, seriously, quotation, "Now is the time for you to feel our pain." The words of Osama bin Laden some years before he was killed. I believe that one of the drivers for acts of terrorism is simply and powerfully revenge. revenge not by so much by the marginalized, but by those, or on behalf of those, who are deemed to have suffered at the hands of the West, not only by the recent wars and interventions, but also by decades of intervention, economic exploitation, political manipulation, and military domination, going back to the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. And it was significant that if you read the kind of thing Osama bin Laden said to justify his acts of terrorism, which can never be justified, but he get the reason, get the mindset behind it, was his belief that, quote, the Christian West had overthrown the Ottoman Empire for its political, economic, and power purposes. Of course, there was no religious motivation for that, but that's how we understood it. The second thing is that while it is true, as speakers have said, that there are those who are disenfranchised and marginalized in our societies who are drawn to these causes of Islamist terror, they're not all like that. Several years ago, there was an attack on Glasgow Airport. And living in Edinburgh, that seemed a bit close. And it was carried out not by anybody marginalized or poverty-stricken, carried out by two doctors, of all people, who lost their lives in they set alight a vehicle, tried to break into the airport, blow things up. They were frustrated and they lost their lives, but they were not marginalized by any means. I used to meet, before they all passed away, members of various political movements who had taken part in the Spanish Civil War. They fought in the International Brigade in the 1930s. They were attracted by a cause to fight against fascism and to fight for democracy. There's no parallel at all between those causes and those of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. However, the parallel is that people can be attracted to fight for a cause in a faraway country which they believe to be just. This is not to justify it, it is to help explain it. And part of the ideology/theology of Islamist terrorism is the belief in end time. If you know what end time is, read the book of Revelation in the Bible. The belief that the world is coming to an end, that the events in the world today presage the end of time, the end of the world as we know it, and the ushering of a new world by God or whatever power is defined. And this apocalyptic sense, this end-time sense, is very much part of the motivation of the Islamic State. It wasn't so much for Al-Qaeda, but it certainly is for Islamic State. And the fear is that even though Islamic State can be defeated, that it will be eventually, in Syria, militarily defeated, in Syria and in Iraq, it is already shifting in a big way to Afghanistan, according to authoritative reports, and this was likely to continue. So, at the Munich Security Conference in 2016, the French Prime Minister Manuel Valls made this statement: "We have entered a new era characterized by the lasting presence of hyper-terrorism. There will be attacks, large-scale attacks. It's a certainty. This hyper-terrorism is here to stay. The force of the ideological fascination is formidable. And if we have changed era, it is because this hyper-terrorism is in the heart of our societies." Well, he was describing the situation. Then, of course, it got far worse in France throughout the rest of that year, and affected also Germany, surprisingly, which is not involved very much in military activities in the Middle East. And it involved, of course, Belgium, tragically, and now London. But, of course, the recent discussion about the nature of the life and transformative life of Martin McGuinness has reminded, of course, of IRA terrorism. And, of course, the IRA killed far more people in Britain than so far Islamist terrorism has done. There was a historical precedent for all of this. It goes right back to phenomena like the nihilists in 19th century Russia. Remember the Red Brigades in Italy and in Germany in the 1970s. This is part of a continuum of terrorism. However, it must be said that the Islamist terrorism has produced a greater state response in many ways than IRA terrorism. A greater debate and often action about changing civil liberties in order to deal with the new phenomena. And also, of course, more armed police on the streets than was the case at the time of the IRA, but perhaps I'm wrong on that. I think the reason for this is that there was no one to negotiate with. Because when the IRA terrorism was going on, there were secret back channels of negotiation between successive British governments and the IRA, and British forces were under strict instructions not to kill the leaders. That's why Martin Luther survived. He was on hit list, because if you kill the leaders, you can't talk to anybody, and they're not there to be talked with. And I think the lack of a possibility of any kind of dialogue, although rather courageously put forward by Labour MP Owen Smith, the absence of any possibility of dialogue with movements like Islamic State is a very formidable factor, and the reason why the state response is much stronger, I think, now than was the case before. Also, of course, suicide bombings were not part of the IRA methodology. Also, of course, part of this is that this new terrorism, if you call it the new terrorism, knows no boundaries. It isn't about an agenda in Britain and Ireland. It's about an international vision. And it is to do with religion. It's to do with a very perverted form of Islam. It's not Islam. We can just discuss all this endlessly. But it's come out of Islam. It's like a heretical movement. It's a heretical movement. My Muslim friends tell me this. It's a heretical movement within Islam, or out of Islam, however you define it. And therefore I think the state response has been stronger because it is seen as a civilizational conflict. I don't think it's the case that the terrorist on Wednesday wanted to destroy our values. He was making a theatre of violence statement, probably about revenge. But we don't know enough about him to really be sure about that. However, although I am a sort of professional practitioner of things religious, having Rev in front of my name and have to do the party line, I have to confess that from the earliest times, religion has been not only misused, but used deliberately as a justification for violence. The Lord God himself will go over before you. He will destroy these nations before you, so that you shall disperse them and dispossess them. A reference in Deuteronomy to Moses sending Joshua over the Jordan to get the promised land. And then Joshua is recorded as saying, "They utterly destroyed all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and asses, with the edge of the sword." And there are many examples, sadly, in the Old Testament of genocide. Well, of course, other countries are doing likewise. We don't have them recorded, though, do we? We don't have any record what the Canaanites were up to, or the Jebusites, or the other peoples, but nevertheless, this is in Holy Scripture, so called. Not that I would call that particularly holy. It has often been said in recent days that one of the aims of Islamist terrorism is to divide communities and to encourage people to be anti-Muslim. I have no doubt that there are many people in this country who are anti-Muslim, partly because of the terrorist actions. And therefore I think it's absolutely vital that much more public attention, far more public resources is given to constant and close engagement with the Muslim communities and by the Muslim communities with the wider community wherever they are. Now, there have been recent examples last few days of events in Birmingham and elsewhere, showing that to be the case. But it doesn't have to be the case just after a terrorist event. It has to be an ongoing process. The reason why I get involved with Interfaith Edinburgh is that after 9/11, myself and a few church ministers in Edinburgh gathered and we said we must do some small something to respond to this. And we decided to hold, first of all, prayer meetings and then public meetings for reflection on the issues, which led to close links with at least one of the mosques and good relations with other mosques to make sure they're not isolated, but they're engaging with Christian and other faith communities. And the particular faith community that I'm involved with in this dialogue is one called the Annandale Street Mosque in Edinburgh, where the leaders have over the years devoted themselves to being closely engaged with the community. So one of the leaders of the community got the OBE for his work with the Edinburgh police. They should understand the nature and culture and values of the Pakistani community. So those kind of things need to go on a continuing basis, and not just as a response to a particularly awful historical act. And public institutions need to provide resources for this kind of activity. And I know that my friend Ian Stewart, who runs the Interfaith Association in Edinburgh, is at his wit's end to get money just to carry on the interfaith work, simply because with all the budget cuts, neither the City Council nor the police nor the Scottish Government can come up with any or very, very little money. I also think that there is a strong theological tradition within warped Islam, within Islam misused for violence. And I've said this before, and pardon me if some of you heard this before. This really began with the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, because he proclaimed the world as dominated by the two Satans, very theological. And one Satan was the United States, which was materialistic in its consumerism and capitalism. The other was the then Soviet Union, materialistic in its Marxist ideology. And he called upon Muslims throughout the world to dedicate themselves to the overthrow of the two Satans. And when the West got involved in opposing the pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan, they had no idea that what they were doing was actually helping, in a backward sort of way, bin Laden's agenda. Yeah, a couple of minutes. Come on. Because the overthrow of the pro-Soviet regime in Afghanistan emboldened a whole new generation of anti-Western Islamist forces to go elsewhere, Chechnya, Bosnia, etc., etc. And that also had implications in many parts of the Middle East. There's also the Egyptian theorist who died in an Egyptian prison, Ayud Katoub, who has been regarded as the kind of Karl Marx of Islamist theory. It's very, very... Katoub, pardon my pronunciation, who put forward a very strongly anti-Western agenda and vision to challenge Islam. And of course, most recently, one has had the speeches of someone like bin Laden. However, terrorism poses very special challenges to the peace movement. I believe this is the first conference ever held by a peace organisation in Britain to deal with terrorism. The others have all ducked it. No, they got very busy, of course, they have agendas, but why has it not been on the radar of the peace movement? I mean, this is violence in our own country, so why has it not been dealt with? Because we believe pardon?
Sorry, except his.
Yeah, except yours. We believe in dialogue, in non-violent conflict resolution, in diplomacy, in soft power, in UN peacekeeping. And we believe that negotiation can bring violence to an end. And we are still challenged to see how that can be applied in the present situation. I don't have an answer to that. I'll leave that open. But I believe that this is a profoundly challenging issue. I think it's one the peace movement must go on confronting, not just in this conference, but other meetings too. Thank you.
And now we're going to hear from Vijay Mehta, who has been the master organizer of this event, one of the key people. He is author and chair of Uniting for Peace. He's founding trustee of Fortune Forum charity. Peace Beyond Borders is his latest book, published by New Internationalist in 2016. The Sunday Times has described him as a long-standing activist for peace development, human rights, and environment. And Vijay will talk about responding to terrorism, building a culture of peace.
Thank you, Rita, for kind introduction. Hello and welcome again. Dear friends, we are confronting global terrorism. And we need to better understand and be open about threats of terrorism and war on terror. Why can't we discuss terrorism in a more honest and open way instead of being manipulated on a massive scale by the leaders, by the media, but you name it. As you can see with the recent Westminster attack, any television channels, not in UK, Europe and USA, all you can see is this terrorist. Do we want to know where he was educated, what he was doing? Of course not. We want to know how to deal with it. But of course, media is playing to a gallery. So how can we curb this war on terror? Certainly not by old militaristic model, applying more military means as conflicts around the world. What do? They yield rich pickings for the military-industrial complex. So while liberals, politicians, law enforcement, and the media are together or complicit in blaming religion and Muslims for war and violent crime, which you alluded as well. So in my talk today, I'll be outlining 10 counter-terrorism strategies which we can tackle, or which we can adopt to tackle this global menace, and along with actions for building a culture of peace and non-violence. Dear friends, terror and violence dominate the daily news in the media, while at the same time 20,000 people die of hunger, starvation, and preventable disease per day, but that's not a news. The increase in terrorism, extremism, and fundamentalism, and these fruitless wars and massacres in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Pakistan, and the present terrorist attacks in Paris, Berlin, Istanbul, and now in London have created a very toxic, dangerous atmosphere of violence and fear, as if the whole world is up in arms. And it's worth noting that none of these countries have ever attacked US, UK, or for that matter, any other European country. According to Global Peace Index, terrorism is on the high, and we had 13,370 terrorist attacks in more than 93 countries, killing more than 32,000 people. And with the economic cost of this violence running into $14.3 trillion US. The strange fact is, 40 countries, including some of the G20 big countries, are funding the gruesome activities of ISIS and other terrorist organizations. So what is all doing? All it's doing is making handsome profits, as I said before, for the military-industrial complex. No wonder the stocks and shares of leading weapons and defense industry manufacturers like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics have surged after the Paris attacks. It seems that selling arms to most reactionary and authoritarian regimes has become the ultimate purpose of the military for profit and control of resources in many parts of the world. So war on terrorism itself is terrorism. When we are sending military anywhere, that is, we are starting a war on terrorism. So how do we curb it? Let's be open about it. When I say let's be open about it, let's be open about the security threats in Europe and around the world. It occurs to me that openness in our world is ever harder to find. I've noticed that nowadays people who profess to speak openly often do so only to express generalizations about very large groups of people. All Muslims are the same. All women think the same way. Indians are good at maths. I am not. My wife is, she's sitting at the back. She's like a computer. Many people seem to find comfort in such generalizations because they are a shortcut. If I could offer one axiom for debate in the modern world, it would be this: never generalize about large groups of people. It is the fastest way to being certainly wrong. And also, generalizing people and opposing them against each other, that is just creating terrorism. So let me tell you some headlines from the past year. The 10 worst anti-cop signs at Black Lives Matter rallies. And men-only Muslim swimming pools are an insult to a United Kingdom built on equality. Perhaps you will agree with me when I suggest that the drumbeat of conflict and violence can be heard beneath these kind of headlines. This is not the kind of openness which will keep us safe. And all this raises a troubling thought. We know we are being manipulated on an industrial scale. And could these two be linked? Why is it that many Western institutions seem shocked by President Donald Trump, not because of his contempt for women or minority groups, but because he dares to suggest that Russia isn't the threat we are told it is? When there are so many good reasons to criticize Trump, why is he attracting so much attention for criticizing Vladimir Putin? One answer could be to say, well, Trump is a deplorable human being, so everything he says must be wrong. But isn't that just another easy generalization? And does not explain why so much official attention, the CIA, the Pentagon, the NSA, been paid to Trump's relationship with Russia, and why his views on this issue, above all others, have been so furiously denounced by senior US military and intelligence officials. Could it be that there is something else going on, or there is something else wrong? Could it be that there are financial interests at stake? Of course they are. Because in December, Trump issued a tweet in which he condemned what he called the tremendous cost and cost overruns of the Lockheed Martin F-35 jet fighter. Trump suggested that the US goes back to using Boeing older F-18 model. Even the Trump's most vigorous detractors must surely concede that on this issue he has a point. In March 2016, Time magazine reported that the cost of the F-35 over its lifetime, the figure is risen to 1.45 trillion US dollars. Let me repeat that. 1.45 trillion US dollars. Can we honestly say Trump's tweet condemning this program was wrong? For me, openness is about intellectual bravery. It takes bravery to be a person who is prepared to disagree with his, her, or her colleagues, friends, and family. It requires bravery to be a person who says that although Trump is wrong and offensive in many parts, many ways, he might not be wrong about Russia or the outdated Soviet era weapons and alliances such as military alliance like NATO. So it requires bravery to be the person who says that not all Muslims are pursuing the same agenda, and that not all aspects of Western civilization are superior, and that not all of our men and women in uniform are brave and noble. So, in the spirit of openness, let's each try to summon up the intellectual and moral energy to confront the complexity of our world, rather than hiding behind the wisdom of crowds and behind the false in which too often we seem to be hurting ourselves. Now let me quickly go to the 10 ways to stop terrorism. Number 1, addressing the root causes of terrorism, which some speakers have already spoken, so I'm not going to say more, except to say the root causes are complex, involving historical grievances, contemporary wars, and occupations of mainly Muslim majority lands, religious intolerance and social polarization closely linked to injustice, austerity, and globalization. The funny thing is, the increasing failure of neoliberal economic model resulting in inequality and widespread marginalization of educated and knowledgeable population are some of the other root causes which are not discussed often of extremism. It's naive to think it is possible to overcome terrorism by military means. Second strategy is strategy for openness, which I've already said a lot, but all I say is the strategy for openness is dialogue, diplomacy, conflict prevention, and cooperation between governments, cooperation and civil society for addressing threats and security concerns. So, let me suggest a campaign that military budget of nations, all nations in the world, should never be bigger than the budget for health, education, and development of a country. Next one is my strategy, number 3, is we are all one. To stop terrorism, we need to realize it's not us or them, but we are all one in this together. And we have to resolve the problem together. I attended a lecture at PeaceJam conference at Winchester recently, given by the Nobel laureate Lema Gabovi, who explained the concept of oneness beautifully. She alluded that this sense of common humanity at its deepest flows from a mystical experience of oneness. This is why the growth in inner peace is a vital contribution to the peace of the world, and why the roots of lasting peace are to be found in the greatest religious and spiritual traditions of the world. I know the religion has been criticized today, but it has got its good points as well. And non-violence is nurtured by inner peace and spiritual development, which will lead to universal peace. My fourth point is, so stop overthrowing the moderates and arming the radicals. Well, that's what we are doing. We are arming the most violent radicals in the Middle East as part of a really stupid geopolitical strategy to overthrow leaders we don't like. Saddam Hussein, Assad, Gaddafi. So my next fifth point is, stop supporting the dictators who fund terrorism. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest sponsor of radical Islamist terrorism. And yet, US has been supporting the Saudis militarily, with national security agency, intelligence, and every other way possible for the last 70 years. The US-backed dictatorship in Qatar and Bahrain also massively fund ISIS. So my next point, which is number 6, is stop bombing and invading when a negotiated installment is on the table or is offered. The US rejected offers by Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria to surrender and instead proceeded to wage war. And security experts, including both conservatives and liberals, agree that waging war in the Middle East weakens national security and increases terrorism. By number 7 is stop imperial conquests for Arab oil. Yeah, that's what we have been doing all over last 60, 70 years for oil and gas. And the number 8 is stop drone assassinations of innocent civilians. Even the CIA officers have said that drone strikes increase terrorism. So we can't find more evidence than the CIA saying themselves. And stop torture, my 9th point, which is, as we know, that torture in prisons and elsewhere create more terrorists. And number 10, my last one, is stop mass surveillance. And National Security Agency have admitted, the US one, that if collecting too much information will never stop terror attacks. Now let me quickly move on to the culture of peace, actions, and non-violence. Now I'm going to give you, I've got about 10, 15, I'm going to give you 3, 4 out of it. Number 1, appoint peace advisors to presidents, prime ministers, whose job should be to give alternative peace solutions to conflicts and terrorism, which would surely make the world a safer place. We have our Vice President, Lord Frank Judd. He was the Minister for War, the Defense Minister now, then he became a peace activist. And he told me, Vijay, when we have a cabinet meeting, we only say to each other how many tanks we are sending, how many military we are sending. We never ever discuss peace or alternative solutions. Nurture a culture of peace, bridge building between hostile communities. That's obvious. Starting a dialogue, diplomacy, mediation, which is obvious. This one is one of my hobby horse, which is, instead of opening war academies all around the world and recruiting soldiers, establish peace cities, peace universities, peace ministries to develop peace policies adopting alternatives to violence. And holding meetings like today, which Brian has said, this is not going to be our first meeting on global terrorism. We're going to have some more, maybe one in Edinburgh, some other parts of the country. So we are going to have more meetings of that. And that is a very important one. We need global religious leaders to speak out against violence, terrorism, and have a dialogue and cooperation between faiths for building harmony, and start a campaign for counter global terrorism. Let me inspire the audience. Change begins with one person. Gandhi, Mandela, and Martin Luther King were individuals who fought against their political system to achieve their objectives. And my last action for peace point is we have 1.8 billion young people in the world, men and women. And we want to make them a driving force to prevent extremism and work for building a culture of peace, which we are going to do very, very in a better way this year. And that's one of the reasons we are now partnering with PeaceJam. Okay, I'm going to really go to my conclusion, otherwise you're getting late for your tea. Okay, real change would be to alter the paradigm built on violence as a solution, and to stop training successive generations of soldiers and jihadists to kill or to be killed in a war. As I said before, it's not a joke. It's the economic impact of violence is 14.3 trillion. Just imagine how many hospitals, jobs, nurses, schools, universities we can open on that. This is equivalent to the combined economies of Canada, France, Germany, Spain, and UK. So to prevent terrorism and end wars, heal wounds, reconcile communities and nations, build durable peace, and we require citizens and leaders with vision, courage, determination, humility, and compassion. In conclusion, what we need today is urgent change by extraordinary change makers, courageous peace leaders who do not give up against all odds to inspire global movement for a just and peaceful world. Our greatest strength as individuals is citizen power. Individuals, organizations, and countries, let us cooperate on a global scale to tackle bold but doable practical steps to stop terrorism, which have at the 10 points which I have outlined, to change things around and sow the seeds for a more just, peaceful, and prosperous world. Then we will have as good a chance as any for building a safer world. Thank you.